You really think that filthy animal is more important than your job? Gregory Sharp's voice thundered through the stables like a rifle blast. He stood tall in his designer boots and tailored overcoat, his face flushed with anger, framed by perfectly styled silver hair. Behind him, two suited men, investors from the city, watched with mild interest, arms crossed and noses slightly wrinkled at the smell of hay and manure. Kneeling beside a visibly trembling Arabian horse was Thomas Reed, a man in his late 50s with sun-worn skin and calloused hands. Thomas barely looked up. His full attention was on the sick horse sprawled on the straw-covered floor, panting heavily. "I couldn't let him suffer, sir," Thomas said quietly, pressing a cool, damp cloth to the horse's neck. "He collapsed just after feeding, his heart's racing. I've seen this before." "I don't give a damn what you've seen before." Gregory's voice was sharp as a whip. "You're not a vet. You're a janitor with a shovel. If this horse dies, that's a $2.5 million loss. You think your paycheck even covers a single hoof?" Thomas didn't respond. Not out of fear, but out of principle. The other stable hands had long stopped pretending to work. They stood frozen, stealing quick glances, afraid to get involved. Gregory Sharp didn't tolerate mistakes, and certainly didn't respect anyone who earned less than 6 figures. "This is what I get for hiring sentiment over skill," Gregory continued, waving toward Thomas like swatting a fly. "You people never learn. You follow your feelings instead of orders. That's why you never move up in life."
"You people," the words hit harder than any slap, and Gregory knew it. He loved the power that came with humiliation, especially in front of an audience.
Still on his knees, Thomas whispered softly to the horse, ignoring the sting of those words. "Stay with me, Valiant. You're a fighter, boy." Gregory scoffed. "You talking to the horse now, like that's going to bring him back to life?" He turned to the investors with a smirk. "See the circus I run here?" The investors chuckled nervously, unsure if they were witnessing a breakdown or a breakdown in management. But Thomas kept working. He gently massaged the horse's neck, listening to the irregular breathing, remembering what his father used to say. "A sick horse will give up if no one believes in him, but if he feels trust, he'll try." Thomas called over to a nearby worker, Caleb, a younger stable hand. "I need the chamomile tincture from the cabinet, and some glucose solution, quick!"
Caleb froze. "But, Mr. Sharp Dash." "Now, Caleb," Thomas said, firm but calm.
Caleb ran, his heart pounding. Everyone knew Gregory's wrath wasn't reserved only for the help, but something in Thomas's tone, unshakable, certain, sparked action. Gregory marched over, stepping between Thomas and the horse. "I said leave him. That's an order."
Thomas stood slowly, squaring his shoulders, eyes locking with Gregory's. "You want to fire me? Go ahead. But that horse needs help. Right now, you can throw me out tomorrow, but tonight, let me save him." There was a long pause.
Gregory, lips tight, turned sharply and stormed out. "You've got 1 hour," he muttered, disappearing down the corridor with his entourage. Thomas immediately returned to the horse, applying the chamomile and glucose mix, stabilizing the breathing, gently guiding Valiant's head into a more comfortable position. He whispered in soothing tones, every gesture filled with care. He didn't care about saving his job. He cared about saving the creature that everyone else treated like a trophy. The stable was silent except for the shallow breathing of the horse and the quiet murmurs from Thomas. It felt like hours. Then something happened. The horse twitched.
Slowly, shakily, Valiant began to rise.
Front legs first, then back. A breathless hush fell over the stable. And just as Valiant fully stood, sweating, shaking but upright, Gregory returned. His face, once smug, was frozen. Behind him, the vet he had called finally arrived, flanked by the same investors. They all stood in disbelief as they watched the impossible, the $1 million stallion, back on his feet, nuzzling the man they nearly threw out like trash.
Thomas didn't say a word.
But his silence said everything. And what Gregory did next, no one could have predicted. The silence was so thick you could hear the flies buzzing around the hay. Gregory Sharp's jaw tightened as he stood watching the once-collapsed horse nudge gently into Thomas's shoulder. The vet, a man in his late 40s with years of equestrian medicine behind him, blinked twice and stepped closer, stunned. "I don't believe it," he whispered. He shouldn't even be standing right now. That kind of collapse usually ends with a lethal injection. "What did you do?" Thomas, still holding the cloth and a nearly empty tincture bottle, replied without looking up. "Trust, and some chamomile." Gregory scoffed, embarrassed. "Don't be ridiculous. The horse got lucky, that's all. And this drama? Not acceptable." But no one laughed this time. Not the investors, not the stable hands, not even the vet. Something had shifted. One of the investors, Mr. Hall, cleared his throat. "Gregory, maybe we should listen to what he's saying. Clearly, Mr. Reed, Thomas Reed," he said, finally standing upright and facing them all. "Right. Clearly Mr. Reed knows these animals better than anyone else in this building."
Gregory's face turned red. He wasn't used to being second-guessed, especially not in front of money.
But Thomas wasn't finished. He gently guided Valiant into a separate stall, draped a blanket over his back, and began checking his vitals again. "This horse has been stressed for days, overtrained, underfed, and medicated without proper timing. No one's paying attention to his rhythms, just his price tag." Gregory stepped forward, his voice lowering into something more sinister. "You're not a vet. You're a stable hand." "I'm also a third-generation horseman," Thomas said. "My grandfather trained military mounts. My father raised racing legends. I may not have a diploma on the wall, but I've got decades of knowing when an animal is dying, and when he just needs someone to fight for him."
The room was frozen again.
Gregory tried to recover his dominance. "You disobeyed protocol. That's still grounds for termination." The vet cut in gently. "Actually, sir, had he not intervened, the horse would have died. He stabilized Valiant long enough for me to arrive. That's more than most trained professionals could have done without equipment." Gregory turned, now fully aware that control was slipping through his fingers. "He broke the rules." "He saved your investment," Mr. Hall snapped. "Let me remind you, this company isn't just about prestige, it's about results, and from where I'm standing, that man gets them." One of the younger investors even took out his phone and started typing. "What are you doing?" Gregory barked. "Posting," the man shrugged. "People love underdog stories." Gregory's eyes darted across the room, realizing the optics. A black stable hand, publicly belittled, just saved a prized animal. The headlines would eat him alive. And yet, instead of acknowledging the mistake, Gregory doubled down. "You're suspended, effective immediately," he spat. "Clear out your locker."
Thomas looked stunned, but only for a second. He wiped his hands on a towel, turned to Valiant, and gave the horse a final pat. "Get better, boy."
He then walked past Gregory without a word. But the quiet wasn't submission. It was dignity. As he exited the barn, whispers filled the air. Stable hands, assistants, even some riders who had seen it all unfold from the upper windows. They weren't just watching anymore, they were talking. One of them followed him out, a young woman named Ellie. "That wasn't right," she said. "You didn't deserve that."
Thomas smiled. "Life's not about what we deserve, it's about what we do with what we get." Back inside, Gregory turned to the others, trying to brush it off. "Let's move on, we've got a schedule."
But Mr. Hall interrupted. We've got a problem, and you just made it worse." That night, social media exploded. Videos, photos, captions. "Man saves $1 million horse and gets fired." "Horse whisperer, humiliated by elite." When compassion gets punished. The story was spreading fast. And the company, suddenly in the spotlight for all the wrong reasons, Gregory thought he could bury it. But by the next morning, the world had already chosen sides, and what Thomas did next turned the narrative upside down again. The next morning, Gregory arrived at the office early, expecting chaos, but not this kind. His phone was buzzing non-stop. Emails, missed calls, mentions on LinkedIn, TikTok, and even equestrian forums he didn't know existed. One headline from a major outlet read, "Fired horseman becomes a symbol of class divide in elite equestrian circles." Gregory slammed his phone down and stormed into the conference room where the other executives were already seated, grim-faced. "We need to control the narrative," he barked. But Mr. Hall didn't even look up from his tablet. "It's already out of your hands." "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," Hall said slowly, turning the screen toward him, "you might have fired him, but he just hired us a problem." The screen showed a GoFundMe page that had been launched less than 12 hours ago. Started by Ellie, the young stable hand. Captioned, "Help Thomas Reed start his own rehabilitation ranch for abused and neglected horses." In bold, just under it, "He saved their lives. Let's give him a chance to save more."
The fundraiser had already passed $150,000.
Gregory felt his chest tighten. How the hell? He doesn't even know how to market himself. He's just a damn stable.
"He's more than that now," another board member said, adjusting his glasses. "He's a symbol, and people love a story of injustice." Meanwhile, Thomas was nowhere near the chaos.
He sat on the porch of his small home at the edge of town, his phone vibrating in his lap. He hadn't opened it since last night. He didn't need to. He wasn't doing this for fame. Ellie arrived with groceries and a handful of envelopes. "You've got letters?" she smiled. "Let me guess, more bills?" She shook her head. These are donations and notes, some from other ranchers, a few from people you don't even know. One's from a retired jockey. They're calling you the Whisperer now." Thomas chuckled. "That's dramatic."
She sat beside him, looking out at the barren field. "So, what now?"
He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at the open land, the memory of his father's hands building the old training fence still vivid in his mind. Then he spoke. "We build, one stable at a time." Back at the company, the investors were panicking. Clients were pulling out. Endorsement deals were being frozen. Even the mayor's office had released a statement calling for greater accountability in elite sports organizations. Still, Gregory refused to apologize.
Until he was forced.
Mr. Hall called an emergency board vote. The result? Gregory was removed from his position as CEO.
Disgraced. Finished.
And the man he had mocked, the man he publicly humiliated in front of cameras, was now the talk of the entire equestrian world. But that wasn't even the twist that truly shook everyone. Because 2 days later, Thomas held a small press conference in a borrowed field where 3 horses grazed lazily behind him. His clothes were plain, his voice was calm, but his message hit harder than any press campaign Gregory had ever paid for. "I'm not here for revenge," he said. "I'm here for the animals, for the overlooked, for the underdog. You can take titles, positions, and checks, but you can't take heart. That belongs to the work." The video went viral in hours, thousands of shares, messages of support from around the world.
He didn't cry, he didn't gloat.
But in that moment, he stood taller than anyone in a suit ever had. And back at the old barn, Valiant was running again, strong, proud, alive. The barn was quiet, the kind of sacred silence that only comes after chaos has passed. Thomas stood at the edge of the training ring, watching Valiant trot with newfound strength. The scar down the horse's left leg still showed, but he moved with confidence, like he knew he had survived something meant to break him. The ranch was no longer just a dream. Volunteers arrived daily. Some brought tools. Others brought feed. But most brought something even more valuable: belief. Word had spread far beyond the horse world. A famous country singer had posted a video supporting the ranch. A retired NFL player had wired funds anonymously. An equine therapy center in Colorado offered to partner. Thomas stayed humble through it all. "I'm not a businessman," he'd said during a podcast interview. "I'm a caretaker, always have been, always will be." That line alone became a viral quote.
Meanwhile, Gregory's world had collapsed.
Reporters circled his gated mansion like vultures. His face was a meme, his name a warning in business seminars. "Never underestimate the power of public integrity," one leadership expert tweeted, alongside Thomas's photo. But the greatest blow came when the Equestrian World Federation, once Gregory's closest ally, announced they were severing all partnerships with his former company. Ellie, now Thomas's assistant and media coordinator, handed him a tablet with the headline, "From Stable Hand to Changemaker, the man who shook a billion-dollar industry." He skimmed the article. "That's a bit much." She smiled. "Not really. Look what you've started." Thomas looked around. Young kids were petting ponies. A woman in a wheelchair was being guided through a therapeutic ride. Valiant neighed proudly from his paddock.
It was everything he had wanted, and more.
Suddenly, a sleek black car pulled up to the ranch gate. Out stepped a woman in heels, clipboard in hand, designer bag over her shoulder. She approached with purpose. "Mr. Reed?" Thomas wiped his hands on his jeans. "That's me." "I represent the Winston Foundation," she said. "We've followed your story closely. Our board is impressed by what you've built here. We'd like to discuss a long-term partnership, equine therapy, community outreach, national expansion." He blinked. "That's big."
"We think you're ready."
Ellie leaned in, whispering with a grin. "Told you this wasn't just about a horse." Thomas shook his head slowly, eyes scanning the land his father once worked. It never was. In that moment, the story stopped being about revenge, or viral fame, or social media buzz. It became about transformation of land, of legacy, of people, because Thomas Reed didn't just prove Gregory wrong, he redefined what right looked like. The man once laughed at for having dirt under his nails now held the future in his hands. And he planned to use it to build something no one could tear down, not out of spite, not out of ego, but out of love. Love for the animals, love for the forgotten, and most of all, love for what could grow when you finally stop being ashamed of where you came from. The sun dipped below the tree line, casting long golden shadows across the ranch. A soft breeze carried the scent of hay and pine through the open field, where children laughed, volunteers fed horses, and soft hooves tapped against earth that once knew only silence. Thomas stood on the porch of the main barn, arms folded, watching as Valiant trotted freely. The horse no longer limped, his coat glistened in the fading light. A survivor, just like the man who saved him. But now the barn wasn't just a barn, it had become a sanctuary. There was a moment, just a year ago, where none of this seemed possible. A man humiliated, fired, told he was replaceable, a sick horse thrown aside like old equipment, a dream ridiculed by people who wore suits and drove imported cars. Thomas had no investors, no status, no power. What he had was integrity, love, persistence. Those became the foundations of a movement no one saw coming. And now? Schools were bringing students to learn about animal care. Therapists were training to use equine-assisted healing. Families were traveling across state lines just to volunteer for a weekend. Even the Winston Foundation's offer wasn't the biggest surprise. The biggest one came in the form of a letter, handwritten, delivered by courier. It was from Gregory, the same man who had mocked Thomas, laughed at his barn logic, and fired him in front of executives. Now Gregory's words were softer, regretful. He admitted he was wrong. About Thomas, about Valiant, about everything. "I built a company," Gregory wrote, "but you built a legacy. If there's any way I can support the ranch now, quietly, anonymously, I'd be honored." Thomas stared at that letter for a long time. He didn't feel triumphant. He didn't feel vindicated. He felt at peace. Because true greatness never needs applause. It doesn't bark orders or flash gold watches. It plants roots. It nurtures. It heals. Thomas folded the letter and placed it in the old wooden box where he kept his father's watch, his first hoof-pick, and the original plan he drew for the ranch on the back of a napkin. Down below, Ellie called out, "We need you at the training ring."
He smiled and walked toward the laughter, the horses, the second chances.
Because Thomas Reed may have started as just a caretaker, but now he was a builder of futures. If this story moved you even just a little, share it. There's someone out there who needs to remember that heart, not power, is what truly builds empires. Like, comment, and subscribe for more stories that remind us of what really matters.